So we're starting our movement module with the skeletal system, which is ultimately going to provide us with an anchoring system to allow for muscles to contract and anchor to. The skeleton does not just provide anchoring though, there's other functions that are involved with the skeletal system as well. And so we're going to go into those 5 functions, and then we're going to talk about a long bone and what are the different parts of the long bone. If you remember from the lab, we talked about different shapes and different types of bones, with our focus being the long bone. We're going to keep that focus here as well. We're also going to talk about how bones grow and remodel and repair themselves, what hormones are involved in bone growth, and then we'll get into one of the common disorders, which is osteoporosis, and then get into actually identifying different bones, dividing the skeleton into 2 main parts, the axial and appendicular parts. And then we'll talk a little bit about joints as well. So our 5 main functions of the skeletal system, one we've already kind of covered just briefly, and that we're providing support, right? We're an anchoring system for all those muscles. So we're helping hold up the body. We're also going to provide protection for softer, squishy parts. We're going to produce blood cells. That should be something that you remember from earlier chapters. We're also going to serve as a storage facility for certain minerals like calcium and phosphate, as well as fat. And then we allow for movement by attaching to the muscles. And that kind of ties into our first function with providing that support. Now, again, in the lab, we discussed different types, different shapes of bones, and we named a few of them, right? Long, short, sesamoid, flat, irregular. We're not going to get into each of those types. There are other classes for that. We're going to focus on the long bone, which again is like a cartoon kind of bone. If you think about that cartoon bone that, a dog would be chewing on, that's the long bone, right? It has those rounded out ends and a long, skinny middle portion. That long, skinny middle portion is also known as the shaft of the bone, and a more specific term for that would be the diaphysis. And in that diaphysis, we find compact bone, a tighter, more rigid, more organized form of bone, along with yellow marrow, which will contain fat. And then on each of the ends, we have the epiphysis, or epiphyses if you're talking about more than one. This is where we find the irregular, patternless, spongy bone, and we have hyaline cartilage on the ends as well. That spongy bone is also where we find red bone marrow. That red bone marrow is what's going to be responsible for making our blood cells. And so we'll see that red bone marrow in the spongy bone of the long bones, as well as in the flat bones. So when you move on to anatomy, if you do choose to do that, you'll see that as well. And then the entire bone is covered by this living outer portion. It's this fibrous connective tissue. It has blood vessels, it has nerves, it has everything surrounding it, and we call that the periosteum. And then lastly, in order to connect our bones to other bones, we have ligaments, right? Not every single bone is going to be connected by these ligaments. There are different types of joints, and when you get to higher level classes, you'll talk about those. But for the most part, we see ligaments connecting one bone to another, as opposed to a tendon, which connects muscle to bone. So you'll want to make that distinction. Ligaments are connecting bones to bones, tendons connect muscles to bones. So here we see our long bone. So we see that diaphysis, that long skinny shaft that we see right there in the middle. And we see this ring of compact bone around it. The hollowed out middle called the medullary cavity, and this is where you would find the yellow bone marrow. The yellow marrow is not showing in this image though. Up at the top and also down at the bottom, we have the epiphysis. So epiphysis here, epiphysis down below here, and that's where we mainly find the spongy bone. Right? And that's where the red bone marrow is at. So when we make blood cells with a long bone, that would be the location of that formation. We have cartilage, that's hyaline cartilage along the outside there, and that's going to prevent bone from grinding on bone at a joint. And then we have this little piece here going across that epiphysis called the epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So let's get into those two different types of bone. Again, compact versus spongy. Now, we talked a little bit about this in lab, but we're going to touch on it again, just in case we don't remember. Compact bone, so this is where things are very tightly packed together. We're going to be composed of the osteon. That's our functional unit of compact bone. And it's a very circular, very patterned look. I mean, that osteon has a hollow center called the central canal, and that's where blood vessels can run through. And then the bone cells themselves are called osteocytes, right? Osteo, we think bone. Cyte, we think cells. And just like we saw when we look back to the histology chapter, when we look back at tissues, we saw that bone cells and cartilage cells lived in these little chambers called lacunae. Remember, they live in Lacuna Beach. Spongy bone doesn't have this nice pattern. There are no osteons in spongy bone. Instead, it's much more irregular. We have trabeculae instead that are extending out and around and in different directions. So let's look at the compact bone, because that's going to be our main focus. We're not really going to put too much emphasis on spongy bone. So here's our compact bone. You see it nice and tight and rigid, and then here's our spongy bone here. You don't really see much of a pattern. One of those circular units is the osteon. So that entire circle is the osteon. And within that circle, you see smaller circles. And so each of those smaller circles are lamellae. And then it's hard to tell in this image because they're so small, but you see those little tiny small dots that seem to be a little bit bigger, a little bit thicker than the line, the circle going around. That's where the osteocytes are at. So most of this is not living tissue. Most of this is going to be the matrix, right? The hard calcium salts that give this bone its rigidity and its strength. But those osteocytes are going to be dispersed throughout the matrix. And again, they're found in their little tiny lacunae, their little tiny homes, their chambers, similar to what we see with cartilage, right? So we look at the hyaline cartilage. Here's the matrix. Looks almost like a fluid or a gel-like background. And then we see this circle with a cell inside of it. The cell is the chondrocyte, chondro meaning cartilage, cyte meaning cell. And then the lacunae is the capsule that the cell is living inside of. If we go back to the osteon, we see that there's that opening in the middle, and that is the central canal. So we see that when we look at this bone, we have a direct blood supply, right? So we don't, if you were to break a bone, you would have a very easy way to get nutrients, to get the building blocks to help fix that bone. So that's something important you'll want to pay attention to, is we have direct blood supply here. That's going to be extremely helpful in getting nutrients, getting oxygen, taking away waste. All those sorts of things are going to be easy for bone. And then the very, very outside almost looks like it's peeling away. That is the periosteum. So the periosteum is this outer covering that we see. And you see how it has blood vessels all incorporated throughout? Because again, it is a living covering. We can't talk about the skeleton without talking about cartilage too. There are many different types, and so hopefully some of this is review from histology, but we're going to recap it again. Cartilage is another connective tissue, right? It's one of those supportive connective tissues, cartilage and bone. And there are different types of cartilage. And depending on what type of cartilage you are is going to help define what kind of job you do and where you're found. So we have the three types: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is where we find on the ends of the long bones, like we pointed out earlier. It's also what you find on the end of your nose, and also the ends of your ribs, in your trachea, in your larynx, so your voice box. And there's some flexibility to the hyaline cartilage, right? You can tell because you can kind of move your nose around. So if you take your finger and put it on the end of your nose, you can kind of push it from one side to the other. It can move a little bit, right? Not a ton, but it can move a little bit. Fibrocartilage is the strongest of the three, but with that strength, we lose some of that flexibility. So we lose a little bit of our ability to move and manipulate the space that we're in with fibrocartilage, but we're able to handle larger impacts. We're able to handle more. And so we find this in certain areas that require a little more strength, like the discs between each of your vertebrae in your back or in your knees. Right? Those are both areas that have to hold up a lot of weight. And so having extra strength there is beneficial. And then the last one is elastic cartilage. As the name would imply, this is the most flexible of each of the cartilage types. And so you find this in your epiglottis, as well as the outer portion of your ear. Right? And so elastic cartilage gives a lot of flexibility, but it also maintains its shape. So if you were to take your fingers and fold over your ear, right? You can do that really fast right now. Fold over your ear. Right? You can move the outer ear a lot, but if you let go, it bounces back and takes the shape it had before.